Container queries are one of those new CSS features that everybody's super hyped about, and with good reason. It finally gives us a way to style, scope, and build responsive components against the actual width of the parent rather than the width of the whole viewport. And while this is incredibly powerful and incredibly cool, it's a bit complicated. There is a lot of new stuff you have to learn. There is the actual CSS query that is new that allows you to trigger and to find what rules happen when that trigger happens. That's the actual container query itself.
There's new properties: container type, container name, and container.
Why are there two? Why are they different? Which one do you use? And even maybe the most confusing part of them all is that there is not one, not two, but there are 6 new CSS units related to container queries. What are the differences all, and when do we use them? Well, we are covering all of that today here in the Bad at CSS podcast. Adam, I have been studying container queries lately because I said we're going to do an episode on it. And one of the things I finally realized with container queries is I understand them. For a while
Wait, you're
I was
not
always
bad at it?
I'm still bad. I'm still bad.
I was like, dude, you can't start an episode saying you're good at something.
No. I just said I understand it.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Not the same.
And I understood it before, but I was always bogged down by the syntax or by, I think I did that thing where I started understanding something too soon, or at least, too soon for people not like you who are like, it's their job to understand it too soon. But the spec changing so much made me be like, wait, what is happening? Now that this is a thing, this is a thing people can use. I get it. But I get why it's one of those things that people are like, yes, I know what a container query is, maybe. Because there's a whole lot to container queries, the more than just saying that it's a new way of building responsive, CSS. So that's what we're going to cover today. I know enough, but you know more. So I want to start out in your own words, Adam. What is a container query?
Without saying that it
Container?
queries containers.
No, we're not saying query or container.
So yeah, it's this. So it's where things are. So back in the day, we'd make pages, and that's where it was. But we're kind of at this point now where screens get really, really big, and they also get really, really small, even down to like a watch. And the viewport is less relevant in these moments when you have like components that you're trying to move around to different places based on their most useful context that they have. So it's like we don't care about the size of the entirety of the page or the document anymore. We care about this component owning its own responsibilities in the moment where it's used. And a container query allows you to, by default, query the nearest container, which is probably pretty common. Like if you're in a card, the classic card, you're going to find the card size and query off of that. But you can query multiple things. It's not limited to just the nearest parent. You can reference something by name, which is really nice. So you can have layers of these containers and adapt yourself to each one accordingly based on a use case. And it's just really nice. It just really follows along this, like, we want our components to be portable. Have we talked on the show about how you asked a gorilla for a banana, but you got a gorilla holding a banana?
No.
Oh, it's one of my favorite code things. We always talk about code like it's all abstract and it's, oh yeah, it's easy. Components and classes, it's no big deal. There's no strings attached. And so you're like, oh, cool, I'll just take this component off the shelf and it's a banana. And then you grab the banana, but oh snap, as you're pulling banana towards you, you're like, hey, the gorilla is still attached to this. And it's like all these other things that you have to do to actually get the class or the component to work.
Yes.
So anyway, as we seek towards making actually portable bananas, container queries help us contain our bananas.
I did not have that on my bingo card, but I'm glad it was said. So there are multiple properties that come in with container queries. First, you have to define, before you can contain anything or just do the triggering, the actual query itself, you have to define what the container is, and optionally, but preferably, give it a name.
Like which axis are you trying to query? Yeah.
So Adam, what are those properties?
Well, you can choose inline, which is pretty much the only one that works, which is like the width. But you can contain size, which is height and width, or you could contain block, And I'm excited to tell you towards the end of this episode, I had a recent use case to use container size and to query both height and width, which really there's a very niche use case for it. But anyway, that's the primary, I think, right?
Well, if you specify container, so basically the way it works is you have to say, all right, we have a container uh, element, and this is what we're going to pay attention to and be able to apply rules to. Which is another thing I think that makes container queries a bit difficult, is that there's really three aspects to containing it, whereas with a media query there's two. So with media queries, like I create my rule, and then I create the media query, and then I change that rule inside of there. And it's like I make it, I change it. With container queries, I need to define the container, I need to make the rule, and then I have to change the rule. And there's more places to get lost and to have to like connect together. Now there's easier ways with container queries to solve that, but what I've found is that you end up kind of writing more up front to have more power in the long run. There's
There's an
just like
ahead
a
of time aspect. Yeah,
yeah.
you have to know what you want to query, which also means you have to know who you want to query,
Yes.
and you also have to know that the item can't query itself, which is tricky too. Like in a card, people would want to put container, and they'd say inline size, and give it a name, and then the card is like, well, I want to switch to landscape when I don't have enough space. Well, it's like you can't query yourself. So yeah, there's like a lot of little things have to line up to actually get the container query to work. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah. And so you specify a container, you give it a name, and then from there you want to say, well, what are we querying on? Or like what are we paying attention to? Are we paying
Hmm.
attention to the height? Are we paying attention to the width? Are we paying attention to both? And what I think also is difficult too with container queries is that as CSS developers, we grew up being like, we pay attention to height and width. And then logical properties came onto the scene, and we're like, actually, you don't pay attention to height and width. You pay attention to block and inline. And block and inline have always existed, the whole concepts of block and inline, but we didn't really think about them that much in terms of writing modes now. And so container queries very much rely on that by saying, hey, yes, you can talk about width, but you're really talking about inline. And yes, you can talk about height, but you're really talking about block. And I think that is one of those things that if you're not familiar with logical properties and writing modes, container queries is going to be very confusing for you at first, because it's kind of like, oh, you don't know about those? Go watch this other video or go to chapter 7 and then come back and then continue on learning, which is another, and I've been, because you're my friend and because you have shown me the light, I use logical properties in production too.
Yes.
And so I understood that, but I also understood that, wow, that's something that could be really difficult at first.
It is super difficult at first. Because yeah, it's an entirely different way of thinking about it. You have to think less about yourself and more in sort of a global way. But yeah, I always like to think about it. You learn one thing, you get to reach everyone. Whereas right now we're
Yeah.
learning height and width, and you have to rotate your mind 4 ways to reach the international audiences. And logical properties, you don't. You just have to learn
Right.
one.
So with container queries, we define a container. We optionally give it a name.
Name is optional. Yeah,
Name is optional, but preferred.
I
And
think so. Yeah, it
yeah,
shows some intent.
well, I'm going to get into a whole section saved for this, why I think name containers are really like the way to go most of the time. But one thing that I'm confused on is that what are the properties for defining a container? We have container, but I
Which is
thought there was
shorthand.
this
Yeah.
is which is shorthand. You can put multiple ones in there, and then I thought there was the longhand, whereas you can write container style, where you can write container. Here, let's do some quick
I'm
searching of that.
pretty sure it's container type.
Let's figure this out. Containers.
Yes, it is container type.
Then I got this wrong. because
Oh,
I
look,
always
you
get it wrong.
can't specify block size. So yeah, it is just container type.
Yes.
So container allows you to say the name, and
Container
then a
type.
slash, and then the type,
Oh,
or you can break them out into longhand and
I
say
was
container
just
dash name and container dash type. Yeah.
I was just confusing the two. Yeah. So you were saying you have two properties. You have container type and container. That's it. And so container type, where you can
Container
say
name is the other one.
container name. That's so you have three
So there's
properties.
technically three. Yeah, one is shorthand for the other two. Yeah.
That's right. But that's typical CSS, where I think a lot of learning CSS is just figuring out which properties are related to other properties and not being confused by that by saying like, hey,
Yeah.
it's like when you look at a button reset, you can be like, but it's a button. And you're like, why? Why are there 20 properties? And you're like, no, it's okay. These are all related to each other. It's fine. Same thing with setting anything with the background. You're like, whoa, that's a lot of stuff, but they're all related. And in some ways, not all the time, but sometimes you can put all of those things on one line. But maybe that's not preferred because that can be even more confusing than, it's like doing a math problem, not showing your work.
Very much so. Yeah, you take the mystery out of it when you use the longhand. I mean, I could see a style thing saying you can't use any shorthands. I could also see the CSS working group saying that
Yep.
shorthands were a mistake. Like, look at padding and margin right now. You can't do logical versions because the shorthand is physically baked. That's just
Yeah.
fun to say.
Yeah. So yeah, we have container. So we specify a container, and with either container, the full powerful, the shorthand one, and then we have individual ones for container type, container
Yep,
name, and container type, container name, and
that's
then
it.
and that's it. That's right. The third one is the
Yeah.
shorthand. So from there, we can define what we're doing. Like, hey, I got this card because, of course, we're always going to go with cards. And now I want to move on to querying it, the actual container query itself. And I think this is the syntax that you see everyone like, oh, we got an at container. That seems cool. And at first, I was not. I did not fully understand really the power behind at container, because I was like, okay, at container allows me to say, hey, whenever the container is within a certain width, or I can even use logical properties inside of the range, whenever the inline size is something like that, do these things. And to me, I'm like, seems like a little bit more of a specific media query, because with media queries, the problem is media queries are junk drawers. Like, let's just be serious. Media queries are like, you can try to be really clean about it. You can try to figure out where you want to scope them in your components and all that. But at the end of the day, you will store a lot of unrelated things or complicated things all in a media query. And if you give up any discipline on it, it's just you pull it open and you're like, that's where I put the clamp function for actually, I don't know why you'd have a clamp function in there, but that's where I put that thing. So like media queries are junk drawers. Container queries, I was hoping would be a way to not have junk drawers. And when I saw a container, I'm like, well, that's just like a more organized junk drawer. I was like, because I can scope it down to the parent size, but it's still a bit of a junk drawer because I can't scope it down to the element. But with names, now you can. Do I have that right?
Yeah, you can query a specific name, and so it's not gonna. You take the mystery out. So just like how you're saying with shorthands, you can set all these properties with a shorthand, but somebody has to know how to unpack that. It's same thing with an at container. If you don't specify the name, someone has to guess where the nearest one is, and it could be different anywhere you place the component. But if you give it a name, you're being very deliberate with what you're doing, and you're leaving some breadcrumbs behind. So you gave the thing a name, and then some child queried the thing by name, and you're like, oh, I see what's going on here.
Yeah, with naming, it seems to me almost mandatory. Like, I'm sure there are cases where it's not, where it's good to have an unname for some catch-all type thing. But if you don't name something, it seems like you're just falling back into the junk drawer category of media queries, where it's like I'm
I,
just putting everything in there. It's sure it's in there, but when if I give it a name, you're scoping it, you're providing intention. And if you put all this in something, that I'm a big fan of single file components, and if you put all this in a single file component, now you're cooking with gas. Like, it looks great. You're giving your your component has a name, it has your container has a name, and you're writing this thing that's scoped all within there. And you can almost look at that file as like, this contains all of this. This is hermetically sealed, and I can go port this to somewhere else. And I know that it's going to be fine, because it doesn't matter what the viewport's doing. It matters what that component is doing and what forces are influencing it.
I could definitely see a counter argument though, where like as soon as you give it a name, you take away its portability, and you create a tight relationship, not a loose one, a tight relationship between that child needing to be in a container of that name, or else the queries don't work at all. So I could see, if you want truly portable, making a component that is anonymously querying at container, just says, hey, the nearest container that can tell me the inline size of where I am, I'd like to adapt to that. And that way your component can move more places with knowing less about the destination. But this is a classic conversation. This is just like TypeScript versus JavaScript, right? We're looking at like, do you want L and R on your socks or not? You know?
Oh man, I do like LNR on my socks. This is
I hate
really
it.
good.
I'm like, my socks are over-engineered. They're telling me which foot they go on. I'm like, come on. Now I have Lucy's. I got a Lucy over here with an L on it. I could have put it with another. Anyway.
It bothers me so much too when they get like, you get the socks out of the wash, and then there's like, I got two L's of this, because you get some of the same sock, and then you unbundle it, and then you see the two L's, and you're like, this isn't two L's. This is one big L.
It's a new type of pain. Yep.
I just took an L because I got an L on my R. This is ridiculous. This is going to be a bad day. I assume that you also don't put your utensils in specific drawers. You just got like a big drawer where they all. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right. So
and the little ones are separated from the big ones. Yeah.
Okay. So you have some decorum. All right. Just not on your feet.
Yeah. It's just it depends on where it is. Yeah. I feel like socks, it was like a little over engineered. I was like, this was cute. I tried it, and there's just it's a trade-off. I'm like, and I don't like the trade-off. I preferred when I could just put socks on willy-nilly, anonymous socks versus named socks. How did container queries get turned into socks? That's actually it kind of fits.
It does. And so I see this now because this is similar to @scope, where @scope basically says what's the nearest parent, and I'm going to scope that. And with @scope, though, to my knowledge,
scope takes a selector.
Does take us. Oh, it's because you go within the selector.
It can be anonymous, but it would scope its containment and doesn't reference anything in its parent.
Well, if you put it in like a style tag, it will go to the nearest, and it'll go to the nearest.
That's proximity to the elements. Yeah, that'll find the proximity to the nearest elements that it's by. So its physical style tag near the button tag you put it next to changes.
Which you can mimic the same. I guess you need a rule, but it's like not too dissimilar. We're basically saying like it's close enough, it's finding it, it's matching it. You're doing some sort of proximity to say this container is associated with, this container query is associated with this container. Because if you don't provide a name, this is probably something I don't think we've covered well enough, and maybe something I am also very bad at. If I do not provide a name to a container query, Adam, how does it find what container it belongs to?
Recursive parent node crawling to the first one with a container type defined.
Damn, that was like, I feel like we should let everyone know we did not practice that. That was you just nailed the crap out of that. Like Discovery. I literally was like, here you go. Like, like throwing the ball, and then you were just like ready
Choke
to go.
on this, bro. And I slam dunk it in your face. Now I'm wiggling my tongue at you like, ah!
Yes. Oh my God. Oh my gosh. All right. So what is that? What is recursive node parent crawling dunking again?
Well, it's it can't query itself. So the container, let's say you put it on a button, and it wants to know if it should be a full width button or like a shrunk down button or whatever, right? Like, should it anyway? So you'd say container, and that button's like, okay, I can't query myself, so my nearest parent in the DOM. And this would be contextual too, right? So if you got the same button in multiple areas, it's going to find the nearest one. So it's going to look at its parent node. So I said parent node because I'm talking about like JavaScript. You have a reference to your element, you do .parent node, and it'll give you a reference to the parent. So it looks at that parent, says, hey, do you have a container type? No. Okay, next parent. Do you have a container type? No. And then it's like next parent. And so that's what I mean by
Mm.
recursively crawling parent nodes until it finds one with container type. And it would be like, oh, you have container type. Is it inline size? No. Then I don't care about you because this container query was against width or inline. And so, yeah, it'll do that until it finds a container that matches. And it might even end up being the body or the HTML tag. Those will resolve. So a container query will resolve to the viewport if it found none, which
Okay.
also means you could entirely go in on container queries and never write a media query again if you don't want to, except for things that are like actually media specific. But yeah, in terms of like width, or you could switch.
Oh, I never considered that. It's that basically, if you have a container query of inline size on a full width body, it's basically a media query. It's like that, the Office meme with Pam, where it's like it's the same picture. Like the media query of a full on a body, where if that's the only media query you write or container query you write for the body, it's the same thing as what a viewport media query would be.
There is one clutch difference, and you'll find
Okay.
this on my website, nerdy.dev. If you read a blog post and you switch to Japanese vertical writing mode, so if you visit from Japan and you prefer reading that way, my site will go vertical right to left. Now it's clutch. It's not even optional to use container queries for that use case because media queries are about the media, the physical aspects of the device. A media query has no concept of logical directionality. And
Yep.
so on my site, I use a container query to see if the inline size is, and that's how I'm able to make sure my site can go in any direction, because I'm not querying the device's width, I'm querying the page's inline size. So they are almost the same, except that container queries have that logical aspect that kind of makes them better.
Yeah. So if you, yeah, wow. So you basically could say, I'm not writing a media query ever again. And if I want to be really lazy, I am going to write a body. My container is the body or the HTML tag. And we're just going to use, or it's at container for that tag. There's no other container queries in the whole website. And we're just basing everything off that, which is effectively media queries, but with logical sizing or logical properties.
Yep. You could do
Wow.
logical mobile first.
That is so intriguing. Um, wow. I had another point, and that just has like blown my mind thinking about it that way. Oh, yes, with container queries. So if we don't give it a name, your argument has like, hey, I now have this portable bit of a non-named container query. So this is at container. And now I can add that in. Like imagine a world with CSS modules, native or classic CSS modules. I can import that and say, hey, it goes into here and it's just going to go to the nearest type of parent. And it doesn't, but if I name it now, it's like, oh, why'd you have to do that? Now I'm going to go and
Name
augment
it
it
again.
or
It's just like
name it
TypeScript. You're
again.
like, you typed and made it very firm. Now I have to go teach it everything new. Yeah.
We did this episode, Adam. We don't have to do it again.
It's just so much hand holding sometimes. I'm like, everyone makes it sound like it's easier. I'm like, no, you're really holding its hand more. I don't know, the amount of control. It's just a balance. Control is a balance. Yeah.
That is super fascinating. One of the things, though, that it makes me, oh, you're probably going to hate this analogy even more, is that it feels more even like, I can't believe I'm saying these words. Everyone's going to turn off the podcast. Uh, it's kind of like Java, where it's like, it's a container query factory resolver class where it instantiates a container query that has a name. So what about we conceptually say, I don't even know if this is, tell me if this is possible in a world where I have these abstract container queries. They understand who they are, they understand what they do, and then if I want to apply it and name it, is there a way for me other than augmenting the whole sheet to say, like, I could see this working with a theoretical mixin pattern where it's like, hey, this sets up a container query, but it gives it a name, where it's almost like a function where I'm returning a container query from a function, but giving it a name.
Wait, what was the question? I'm just following
Can
along,
I,
nodding.
You're like, yes, and but can I do that? Is basically it. Like, what is there a pattern for me basically to say, hey, I have a generic container query that can apply to all different sorts of cards, and but that card, his name is profile card, and I need to give it the name of profile card because I don't want to go through and refactor it, or I want names because that gives, I like the intention, I like my hand being held. How are there ways to take generic container queries unnamed and kind of new them into names?
Like give them a name on a fly. Yeah, so it's like a
Yeah.
base class, a container query
Yes.
base class that then you can extend with a name optionally. So at first I was thinking what you wanted was at custom media, which is a way
Oh
to
yeah.
stash a media query into a name. And that's where I do like dash dash motion OK is equal to, prefers reduced motion, no preference. But
Yeah.
I think you're right in that you would need some sort of function or mix-in that would take parameters that could then fill in and then insert that into the page. No, nothing like that exists. I mean, you could write a JavaScript function to do it, but yeah.
You could do like I wonder if we could do like a post CSS sort of thing. You would have to then rewrite it to, through the rules, but you could provide some syntax for this actually, where you say like, hey, I don't know, I'd have to think about the API for this, but you could definitely write something and through post CSS transform it to provide the name, and you would be doing something very bespoke and weird. But we're all about bespoke and weird things, and that would be a have your cake and eat it too situation, where the people like you who are like, hey, get your L and R's off my socks. I'm like, that's fine, but make the socks, but give me an abstract function resolver factory so I can say new socks with a constructor of LNR. And you're like, you know what, fine, I get mine, you get yours, we're happy here. So like I feel like that's a world that we could live in.
Yeah, there's kind of a problem that shows up is like you want it to be portable, so you don't give it a name, but you're like, what if I want both? Like, what if I want it to look anonymously if it didn't find this one?
Right.
Like, which I think is actually how it works in general. Like, if you said at container and gave it a name and it didn't find it, it has to resolve at some point, and I think it falls back to the page. But it would be cool if you could give it a list. Maybe you could do a comma separated list, like look for this name. If you can't find that name, look for this name. If you can't find that one, then do nothing. Because then yeah, we get to be explicit about which moments you want this in, which containers you should change. But if you're in none of those containers, do something smart still. That's a good idea.
All right. Now I want to move on to the units because I feel like this might take a hot amount of time because there are many units and let's see here. We got, I have a whole list of them right here. We have CQ min. Actually, can you
Wait,
actually?
see cumin? Like, is that for like a spice you want to cook
Yeah,
with? Hey, do you see my cumin?
yeah,
I just put it in the dish.
it's good for taco mix. It's pretty much what taco mix is. It's ground cumin.
That's so
Um,
dorky. I like it.
so how about this? Let's go back. I have a list. So let's see. You should be able to do this. I'm going to start with CQ min. Can you do another one? Just got one.
Yep. CQ max, CQI, CQB, CQW, CQH.
Yeah, you got them all.
Okay. I was like, I think that's it.
Yeah,
I just wrote an article on this, so they're fresh in the brain.
yeah. So I understand. I understand a lot of the definitions of them. So like CQI is inline size. So we
Container
are
query inline. Yeah, to help you
right.
memorize the CQ. Yeah.
Exactly. And CQB would be block size. So width. So sorry, I mean height. And then CQW and CQH are width and height, and that's more so not logical property version of that. And then we have CQ min and CQ max. Now, let's first start with why would I use a container query unit over another type of unit? And then at what point, and from there, how do I select those from that?
Nice. Yeah. So one of the reasons that I personally use them is that the percentage unit can be really frustrating in CSS because it changes based on where you use it. If you use a percentage on a font size, if you use percentage on the left and the right of margin and padding, it can resolve either to the height or the width of the container. It's just it gets kind of wiggly. So percentages are wiggly, and often you want to split a container in two. And so you can take the guesswork out of it by using CQI at 50 CQI. Now you know this is 50 of the inline size. You don't have to do 50% and be like, oh, guess. Same thing with blocks. So if you want the height, so you can be very explicit and deliberate about which one that you want, which is, you're not leaving it up to CSS's resolution, 20 years of resolving percentages issues.
Oh yeah. And so when it comes to selecting a container query unit, so we have container query units in general because it is based on we're getting relative to the size of a certain aspect of a certain metric of a container. So that's either the inline size, the the block size, or the height and the width. And what we're saying is that whatever property you're or whatever unit your property you're setting this that accepts this unit, you're going to base its value on the inline size or the block size of that. And so that will change, which is very much getting into how container queries can be very mind bending, is that that's going to change based upon the container size. So this is very much a way to scale up a size, scale down a size relative to the size of the container. Do I have that right?
That's correct. And I have a question for you because with a container query at container, we have the option to specify a name or not. When I say 50 CQI, I don't get to specify a name. So where does it resolve against, David?
So, well, give me a property. Like 50 CQI of what?
Let's do width is 50 CQI on a button inside of a card.
I feel like I'm in a spelling bee. I'm like, can you use it in a sentence? So we have 50 CQI on a button's width inside of a card. So it's saying that the width of the button is going to be 50 container units, or let's just say, I don't want to say percent, but I want to say percent. 50%, half, there we go, of the card, the card's width, or the inline size. And there are, that's another proxy. I know I'm gonna be quiet.
You're right though. Yeah, you have to do logical and this and that. So wait, what if the button is now inside of a section inside of the card, and the section is not full width on the card?
All right. So oh my gosh. All right. I'm like, the files are inside of the computer. No, so we have a button. I have to break this all down. So I want to get this right. So we have a button whose width is 50 CQI inside of a section now, or sorry, inside of a card that's inside of a section.
No, I'm trying to add another layer of indirection.
Right, I'm trying to.
So the button is now 2 levels deep from the card, and it's like,
so the button's 2 levels deep from the card. Okay.
And yeah, the question is gunning at is, do CQ units care about a container type, or do they just go to the nearest container regardless of the presence of container type on there or not?
Believe it or not, that's what I was going to ask you. I was going to say, does it go up to the nearest container? And I was going to ask you, is there another container set? Because from what I understand about them, is that they will look for that really fancy word that you use, the recursive parent container thing. And it will, from what I understand, they will do that. They will look for that one. And if they find it, they will base themselves off of that container, that named container, or just specified container. And if it does not exist, they will effectively act like viewport units. Do I have that right?
I am asking because I'm not sure. That's why I teed it up. I was like, I don't know if he knows the answer because he's going to be telling me right now. I'm like trying to look it up. I'm like, to the dimensions of a query container. So it sounds like they do need to find. It sounds like they do recursion, but I kind of thought that you could use them anywhere.
You can use them anywhere, but I think that they go all the way. I think they
fall back to viewport style.
Yes, that's which is effectively which I guess really makes sense now, because I don't know if that's related or if it's just sort of like the distilling down the concept. But if you don't specify, if you create one container query on the HTML or the body, like we were saying before, it acts like a media query. And so if you don't have a container, CQ units acting like viewport units makes sense, because viewport units are effectively media query units. The media query is on the viewport units, they're on the viewport too. So wow, that to me makes sense. You're muted. And you're muted again.
I am muted. Okay, here we go. So I'm building a little demo. So I've got a card with a section and a button, and the button's going to be width of 50 CQI. Okay, so right now I can see that it is filling the section, which is 50 width, and the card, it looks like it's falling back to a viewport unit. So then if I give this card container type, inline size, okay, now it's 50% of the card. And if I give it to the section, it's okay. So it's as we have described. It is just like a container query in that if it is going to recursively crawl parent nodes looking for container type to be defined so it can resolve itself against that thing. But yeah, container query units though you don't get to specify a container name. So it's always
Right.
anonymous, which is a
Right.
good thing to know.
Right. That makes sense to me because it's latching on to the nearest container, and that could be based upon a named container. But that to me, it makes sense to me that container query units are nameless. That to me is, that gels. Now, the two I didn't cover. What are CQ min and CQ max?
Those are just like viewport units where they're going to look at whichever is the smaller. So if it's like a thin but wide, or it's like a short but wide element, then the CQ min is going to be the height and the CQ max is going to be the width. But if you've got a skinny but tall element, CQ min is going to be the width and CQ max is going to be the height. So they help you kind of pick, almost like cover and contain, where cover
Okay.
will choose the larger size for the object or the image to fit, and contain chooses the smaller. CQ min, CQ max, viewport min, all these do very similar behavior.
All right. And the last thing I want to cover, and maybe the most important thing, is using container queries. It's, to me, container queries have been so hyped up, and like I said, for good reason. But the funny thing that is we distill down what we're using container queries for. It's cards, cards all day.
Every
Everyone,
demo.
every
Yeah.
demo. And what I think is funny too is I work on Firebase, and I have worked on Firebase for almost 10 years. And I need to stop saying that. I feel like in every podcast interview, I keep telling people that, and we're like, we get it.
Of Firebase.
It's been 10 years. We got it. We got it, man. But the funny thing is I've always said this in my time at Firebase, is that everything is a to-do app. Everything. So if because I'm always creating app demos, and someone's like, oh, well, chat app's not a to-do app. And I'm like, yes, you are. You're just chatting about what you have to do. And they're like, well, what about like a grocery list app? I'm like, it's a to-do app, but it's a to-do app, but pretty much it's a to-do app.
Email's a to-do app for sure.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Or you could flip it around. Everything's a chat app. I'm just chatting about what I have to do. But that's basically every app in the world. Now, I've come to think, are we just doing cards because every single component is really just a card component?
Well, Dave Rupert says that a card is just a mini website. So really what we're saying is a container query is just a mini website query.
Exactly. Everyone's like, this is not a container. This is not a card. This is a calendar. And you're like, well, what about the calendar is a big card. And then each day is a mini card. And then it's like, oh, okay. Like, I feel like I could look at anything on a website and be like, those are cards. Like I feel like that might be why. But in our attempt to try not to just talk about cards, I came up with a few things that you can use container queries for that are not cards, but probably are. So my first is that I can see this going I've done some demos where I see this going very well with grid layouts, because if you take a look at a grid column, or just let's take a look at your most simple, basic website layout where you have 3/4 of the page is the article or the main or whatever. And then to the right, you got the aside. And that aside is tall and skinny on a full viewport. And then as the viewport shrinks, maybe you want to stack that card below that big width, so everything stacks below, or maybe it stacks higher. But then an interesting dynamic happens in that like weird tablet size one, where now it's not tall and skinny anymore.
It's big.
It's big and short,
Yeah.
and the viewport is not helping you out there because the viewport's like, you got 800 pixels of viewport, and you're like, oh, okay. And so then you're writing rules that are kind of weird because you're like, okay, be tall and skinny at this point, but then now at this point go do something else. And so you're retargeting this. Whereas with the container query, you're just saying, hey, when your width is this much, you're going to be tall and skinny, and you're going to do this thing. Well, you're going to be tall and skinny because the grid's going to make you tall, but like, hey, that's what's going to happen. And then as your width increases, well, now you can put all this other stuff over here. And so you're not thinking about where it is on in the terms of the viewport or where it turns in the grid. It's just saying, hey, when I have this kind of space, this column is going to, going to extend this way. But that column is probably a card. So okay, but that's how I say it. With grids. With grid, I think container queries are really good. Adam, what's your non-card example?
Well, I just had a grid demo I did last week. It was called the Always Great Grid, and it was like a bento box example that if it had 2 items in it, it looked elegant. If it had 5 items, which usually has that little cliffhanger at the bottom that's all weird shaped, and I handle it and I make it look pretty, and I'm like, this grid handles any number. The other thing I added though was a container query for aspect ratio, so that if it was wide, then it did a different bento than if it was portrait. And that was the first time I've ever done container type size, because
Yeah.
I could then write at container aspect ratio is equal to portrait aspect, or is orientation. I could say at container orientation is portrait. I queried something. Actually, I think I used aspect ratio. Who cares? Anyway, you could find out, like, is this thing in landscape or portrait, and adapt to it. So container queries kind of go beyond just width, and they are especially good for grids. I think they're also especially good for grids because grids, generally, you define a size of your columns and your rows, which is kind of clutch. We skipped over this already. One of the biggest
Oh
foot guns
yeah.
with container queries is you give something a container type and it collapses and it becomes
Yeah.
5 pixels tall. And you're like, what did you just do? And it goes, well, I can't be sized by my children anymore. I'm so sorry. If you're going to query me, I don't know. Now I'm dumb. And you're like, dang it, you're dumb. I have to tell you more about the world so that you can have a size. And anyway,
And then grid is like, oh no, I got you. Like a grid of
yeah,
flex
grid's like stretch
boxes.
here. Yeah,
Yeah.
fit into
Yeah.
this cell. And it goes, oh, good. Now I have height and width again. Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. It's true. Something that if you are, I'm commonly using everything with grid, so I kind of one of the things you kind of get that for free when you're doing it. But it's true if you're doing an isolated one, it's going to be like I'm going to try container queries, and then it's going to be like wah, and you're like, this is good. Like
Yeah, a lot of
we are
ways I
happy about
used
this.
I usually make a dummy node. I even had a thing that was called contain dash nerd. So that it was like a containered
Okay,
element. It was
yeah,
just like anyway, whatever. Okay, I think you got it. And that's all it did, is it would have a name and a type on it. And the name would match the like stupid tag name I gave it or whatever. And that was nice because then the collapsing happened at a very specific wrapper node. It was like a container query wrapper node. And then I didn't have to like intermix my grid layout with trying to handle the fact that it's a container. And then my grid container can query its parent because its parent's just a dumb, thin outline of space. And anyway, those are a couple of my hot tips. Is container queries are great with grid, and it can be really nice to have a wrapper element that is just the container to be queried.
Okay. Well, the last one I'll give is font scaling. You can use container queries to scale up font, and
Yeah.
might be the least card specific one that we got, because you don't need to put text in a card. So even though a website's a card, so okay, but that's it. Font scaling. You can use container queries for font scaling using container query units and everything to as the not card grows in its width, you can scale the font up nice and easily. It's kind of like a different way of doing a clamp function. So I like it. So, well, that is container queries. we have they are easy, they are hard, they are good, they are bad. No, they are good at it, they are good, we are bad. And I very much, I think that one of my we did our resolutions pod, and one of your resolutions was to use container queries for anything but cards, or not cards. I am going to have another resolution now to just use container queries in general. I'm going to move away from media queries. I'm going to make that break. And if nothing other than just putting them on the body and just saying, you know what? This is where I'm starting. You got to start somewhere in the container query space and start on the body, and then just move your way down. So
Hey, do it
that's
on that sweet design you got for our new site. You're building us a new site. You could
we
just,
are.
container query from the ground up there.
Won't be, oh, man, this is one of those things where it's like, it won't be a new site if to everyone listening to this, if it goes according to schedule to the existing site. That's awesome. Well, that's it for this episode of the Bad CSS podcast. And give us more stuff that you want us to cover, or what are you using container queries for? Because, and not cards, or just say cards, that's fun too. But let us know, and if any topics you want to cover. But if not, we will see you on the next Bad at CSS podcast.
Smell you later, y'all. Woo!
Visit the Bad at CSS podcast.